So welcome to another panel in the Cornell Institute for European Studies Migration series. I am the CIS Director Esra Akcan, and with our team Alexandra Perelman, Claire Swensen, and our student assistant Anna Tedianto, Libby Christian, and Siming Zhu. We hope this will be another very lively panel. For those who are coming to our panels for the first time, let me give a bit of a context. This series is in its second year, and we have been organizing multidisciplinary panels on the theme of migration. But we do not only think of the migration of people, but also of images, technologies, objects, words, and hopefully in the future, who knows, plants, cells, animals, food, and so on. Our aim has so far been to demonstrate the historical and contemporary relevance of migration in writing global histories and understanding the present, as well as to put Europe in its global context by discussing it both as a continent of arrival and departure. Our panels have critically addressed European countries' roles in the history of modernization and colonization, and they have disclosed the region's character as an immigrant continent and diaspora of various peoples. The lectures and panels we have so far organized in this series included Academic Freedom and Exile, Will This Robot Take My Job? Migration, Automation, and Employment, Migration of Images, The Arts of the Immigrant Continent, Crossing the Mediterranean, Migration and Death, Exhibiting Yugoslavia, Global 1968, Exiles in the 21st Century, Family Separation, Lessons from Europe's Past, and so on. And all of the information and videos of these panels are now on our website, so please check our migration series page under INID Center's Institute for European Studies. And as part of this broadly defined series, today we are gathered here for the panel, The Future of EU, Immigration and the Rise of Populism, which will bring an historically and theoretically informed scholarly perspective on an urgent topic. Freedom House reports that its global index of civil rights and political liberties has been declining for 13 consecutive years from 2005 till 2018, with 68 countries experiencing a net decline in 2018 alone. Many of these countries are associated with Europe, including Hungary, Poland, Turkey, and Russia. The recent threats to democracy, the rise of populism in Europe and elsewhere, UK's vote on Brexit, and similar trends drive scholars to rethink the strength and the future of EU. The anxieties about immigration seem to shape both the populist and the protectionist discourses. So in this multidisciplinary panel, renowned scholars on the historical and contemporary impacts of radical populism, extremism, immigration, and the role of the state in Europe in the disciplines of political science, sociology, and philosophy will share their perspectives. So let me briefly introduce our speakers, who will make a 20-minute presentation, and we will, a discussion will follow, moderated by Ken Roberts. Okay, did I do this? Yeah, something over, okay. So our first speaker will be Virag Molnar, who received her PhD from Princeton University and is Associate Professor of Sociology at the New School for Social Research. Her research explores the intersections of culture, politics, and social change in Eastern Europe, with special focus on urban and material culture. She has written about the politics of architecture in socialist and post-socialist Eastern Europe, the post-1989 reconstruction of Berlin, and the new housing landscape of post-socialist cities. Her current work focuses on the cultural production and nationalist populism in Hungary. Her book, Building the State, Architecture, Politics, and State Formation in Post-War Central Europe, received the Mary Douglas Prize from American Sociological Association, and she also has been a visiting fellow at many prestigious institutions. Our second speaker, Donatella Di Cesare, teaches theoretical philosophy at Sapienza University in Rome. She is among the leading voices in the contemporary scene of Italian philosophy, very present in the public debate, both within academia and on media. She collaborates with national and international newspapers, magazines, and journals. She's a member of the Italian Council for Refugees. Among her recent books are Heidegger and the Jews, the Black Notebooks, which she presented yesterday here at Cornell, which came out this year from 2018 in Politipress. Torture is another book, which came out the same year. And Terror and Modernity, which is forthcoming in 2019, as well as Resident Foreigners, A Philosophy of Migration, also forthcoming in 2019. So I cannot wait to read those books. And our final speaker will be Kas Mude, who is a professor in the School of Public and International Affairs of the University of Georgia, as well as a professor at the Center for Research on Extremism at the University of Oslo. His research aims to answer the question, how can liberal democracies defend themselves against political challengers without undermining their own core values? His recent publications include The Far Right Today, which is forthcoming this year, right? The Far Right in America, Populism, A Very Short Introduction by Oxford University Press, The Populist Radical Right, a Reader, and On Extremism and Democracy in Europe. And our moderator will be Ken Roberts, who is a professor in the Department of Government here at Cornell University. He's also the director of the IUNADI Center's Latin American Studies program. He teaches comparative and Latin American politics with an emphasis on the political economy of development and the politics of inequality. His research is devoted to the study of political parties, populism, and labor and social movements. Thank you very much. So we will get the speakers in this order.
And let me see if I can find my visuals. I have a few slides for you to show. Oops. Okay, so I'm a sociologist by training, and I would like to speak about two topics in my short presentation. One is the role of immigration in political propaganda, and the other is migration within the European Union, especially east-west migration from new member states to the EU core and its impact on Brexit. And I think this type of migration is much less talked about when we think about the relationship between immigration and the rise of populism in Europe. And also because my geographical expertise is in Eastern Europe and especially in Hungary. So I'll be looking at this topic from this perspective. So let's start with the role of immigration in political propaganda. Immigration to Europe is actually sharply down from a peak of about 1 million irregular migrants in 2015-16 to about 150,000 in 2018. And this rapid and significant decrease is due in large part to a 2016 controversial deal between the European Union and Turkey, new border fences across the Balkans, and the 2017 bilateral agreement between Italy and Libya that all aim to contain migration flows to the EU from the Middle East and North Africa. Yet, political tensions over immigration within and between EU member states remain very high. And immigration continues to occupy a central place in political discourse, and especially in government propaganda in countries that are ruled by populist parties. Given the alarming extent to which political propaganda shapes the political views of the public today, which I think is also a key feature of populist politics, I think it is worth taking a closer look at how immigration is instrumentalized fairly effectively by political propaganda. And I will use the example of Hungary, which adopts and even prides itself on an extremely hardline anti-immigrant stance, even though hardly any irregular migrants have entered the country since the peak of the migration crisis in 2015. So in Hungary, the use of immigration in political propaganda follows a two-pronged strategy. On the one hand, it is meant to instill fear and insecurity in everyday life. On the other hand, it is presented as a threat to national sovereignty not so much because of the actual influx of immigrants, irregular migrants, refugees, however we want to call them, but because of how Brussels, that is the European Union, as well as other international actors, want to force Hungary to prospectively take large numbers of immigrants against the will of the Hungarian people. So let me give you some examples for the first prong of the propaganda strategy. One can have easy, full-on access to government propaganda just by turning on one of the public radio or TV channels that are controlled by and are mouthpieces for the populist Fidesz government. The typical news hour starts by recounting the number of immigrants who tried to illegally enter the country at the southern border, followed by gruesome crime stories from across the continent committed by recent asylum seekers or residents with a migration background. Just a few examples from early January this year, when I last spent some time in Budapest and was exposed to an unhealthy dose of potent propaganda. So the bouquet of early morning stories included a Syrian refugee strangling his teenage 16-year-old Austrian girlfriend in a city near Vienna, an Afghan asylum seeker stabbing a pregnant woman and killing her unborn child in a hospital near Mainz in Germany, and a 21-year-old Ethiopian immigrant holding Spanish citizenship and working as a cook in Vienna who killed his 25-year-old sister, who had come to rescue him from the drug milieu he was ensnared in with a knife at the main railway station in Vienna. These stories are on a continuous loop, repeated as news pieces every hour, all day. And they are not actually fake news or fabricated stories. They do indeed report of tragic events. The problem is, of course, that refugees and migrants are only portrayed in stories like this and are always featured as violent criminals. Also, these stories indicate a slight shift in the nature of fear that is attached to immigrants by the populist media. Previously, immigrants were depicted primarily as potential sources of terrorism and agents of terrorist attacks. But increasingly, they appear as perpetrators of private violence, targeting especially local European women. This is also generally highlighted in the media as a civilizational conflict that follows from women's treatment as second-hand citizens in Islamic cultures. The violence against women is seen as a consequence of Muslim men's inability to maintain relationship with emancipated European women, and of treating especially young teenage women only as sexual objects. So ironically, illiberal populism is often posturing to embrace the liberal defense of gender equality and women's rights in presenting Muslim immigrants as a civilizational threat to the European way of life. In addition to this constant fear-mongering about imminent threats to public safety, the second prong of the immigration propaganda comes directly from the government, most notably in the form of seasonally recurring, government-sponsored nationwide billboard campaigns and diehard populist Prime Minister Viktor Orbán's programmatic speeches. The billboard campaigns are designed to spread conspiracy theory-like arguments according to which large-scale immigration from the Middle East and Africa is actually an organized movement of people, a mass migration orchestrated by international organizations like the UN, NGOs, and figures like the liberal hedge fund billionaire George Soros. Soros has become the face of these campaigns because of some fleeting remarks he made at the height of the migration crisis in 2015 that the EU should be more open to accepting large numbers of immigrants, and also because he financially assisted a handful of grassroots civil society organizations in Hungary that supported refugees in the face of the virulent hostility of the government during the 2015-16 crisis. The first Soros billboards went up in 2017. These are, you can see some examples here with some translations of, what they actually say. And also some, this one on the right it's a defaced billboard. So these Soros billboards went up in 2017, conjuring up anti-Semitic tropes about Jews controlling the world, now organizing mass migration, and personalizing the evil behind the threatening influx of culturally alien foreigners. The latest edition of the large-scale billboard campaign was launched by the government just about a week ago in preparation for the European parliamentary elections in May. In addition to Soros, it also includes Jean-Claude Juncker, right, the president of the European Commission, with whom Orban and his party share membership in the European People's Party in the European Parliament. On the poster, Soros's and Juncker's portraits are paired with the following text: "You have a right to know what Brussels is preparing for." This is what you can see in large caps. And then a list of statements in small caps that read, "They," meaning the European Union, "want to introduce mandatory immigration quotas. They want to weaken member states' border security. They would facilitate immigration by introducing a migrant visa." So these posters actually created a huge uproar in the European Parliament. They provoked a counter poster that tries to rebut the Hungarian government's propaganda statements. And also now the European People's Party is discussing whether they should suspend or expel Fidesz from the faction because of this latest billboard campaign. Also, in his first official speech of the year on January 10th, in this speech, if we print it, it makes up about a 2-page single-spaced text. Prime Minister Viktor Orban used the words immigration and migration 29 times. So if you were to do like one of these word cloud things, like immigration and migration would be popping up in huge fonts. He predicted that these would be, immigration and migration, the dominant topics of the 2019 European parliamentary elections. Moreover, they would also fundamentally reshape the European political landscape. We will see, he asserted in his speech, that the traditional left-right division of political parties will be replaced by a pro-immigration versus anti-immigration split. Euroscepticism will also be dwarfed by immigration as a much more important problem because it raises central civilizational questions about Christianity, gender equality, freedom of religion, and most importantly, national sovereignty. To Orban, the question of national sovereignty is linked to determining who has the right to decide with whom citizens of a community, a European state, want to live together, and whether they want to allow foreigners to settle in their country. In this context, Orban accuses pro-immigration advocates of being anti-democratic because they clearly do not respect the decision of political communities that do not want to accept immigrants, even when these decisions were made democratically. Orban also warns that the issue of migration can ultimately undermine the European Union, as evidently immigration debates played a key role in the UK's Brexit decision. So I think what we see all in all is that Orban is clearly busy keeping immigration at the center of populist rhetoric by tying it closely to key, actually liberal values of European civilization, to national sovereignty, and the very future of the European Union. But I think it's also important to note that these conspiracy theories about the role of foreign actors and influences behind large-scale migration that are spread by the Hungarian government's propaganda machine are not only used to criticize and obstruct EU policymaking. They, and especially the ones centered on the role of financier George Soros, they are also mobilized against local political actors. And also this vilification of Soros is actually not unique to Hungary, but can be found in other East European countries, in Russia, but also in the Balkans, in post-Yugoslav countries, but even in places like Israel. So these alleged links between George Soros and mass migration to the EU have become a linchpin of a comprehensive crackdown on liberal civil society in Hungary. Soros has namely been a generous supporter of pro-democracy and human rights groups in Hungary already since the 1980s, and also the founder of the most prominent private university, the Central European University in Budapest. But now, anyone who works for a civil society group or an NGO that promotes liberal causes, democracy, rule of law, human rights, freedom of press, is simply labeled as a Soros agent to discredit their activities. Moreover, in 2017, the government introduced a mandatory registry, again similar to the ones that exist in Russia and in Israel, for NGOs that receive foreign funding in the amount of about $30,000 or more in a tax year. This backlash against NGOs culminated in passing the so-called Stop Soros legislation in 2018, which further stigmatized civil society organizations by creating a new category of organizations that support illegal migration, by levying a 25% tax on foreign donations received by these organizations, and by upholding the government's right to shut down any civil society organization that is deemed a security risk for supporting migration. And also the mounting attacks on Soros have eventually led to driving out the Central European University from Hungary. So again, in sum, government propaganda around immigration is also forcefully directed at the remnants of liberal groups and liberal intellectual elites in Hungary. And again, Hungary is clearly somewhat of an outlier at the extreme end of the anti-immigration spectrum. But many of these themes and policies, like cracking down on NGOs, are increasingly prevalent in other European countries as well. So let me speak a little bit about the second topic, migration within the EU. Because I think usually when we talk about the relationship between immigration and populism in Europe, immigration is generally understood to refer to migrants and refugees from outside the EU, the Middle East and North Africa in particular. Yet, intensive migration within Europe in the past 30 years has significantly reshaped the continent as well. So between 1990 and 2012, nearly 20 million people left from Central, Eastern, and Southeastern Europe. This is what you can see, and here the colors are not so important. They show different sub-regions of Central and Eastern Europe, but I think you can see the extent of the migration in the past 30 years. For some post-communist countries, this out-migration has had a serious demographic impact. Lithuania's population has fallen by 25%, Romania's by 17%. Almost 1 million Poles live in the United Kingdom, and they make up the country's biggest cohort of foreign-born residents. The effects of this internal migration on the rise of populism have rarely been examined, although in some cases, especially in the case of Brexit, they seem utterly consequential. Concerns about immigration were at the forefront of the Leave campaign in the run-up to the Brexit referendum in 2016. It was one of the key areas where the promise of leaving the EU was seen to allow the UK to take back control, right? This was the chief political slogan of the Brexit campaign. As the referendum campaign kicked in, official statistics revealed near record levels of net migration to the UK, 189,000 per year. Anti-immigration sentiments were running high. In surveys, people were loudly complaining about too many immigrants, and especially too many Europeans. One of the UK's largest tabloid papers, the Daily Mirror, ran alarmist headlines like Brexit to cause immigration surge as 500,000 East Europeans will rush in before the borders close. Theresa May emphasized that her Brexit plan would put an end to the free movement of people, and overall immigration would be reduced to the 10,000, down from the current 100,000. In the days before the Brexit vote, 56% of Brits named immigration and asylum the top challenges facing the country. But the examples also underscore that in the UK, British citizens resented and felt threatened by European and especially Eastern European immigration, and not by irregular migrants outside the EU bloc. The UK became one of the main destinations of labor migrants from the new EU member states, mostly former communist countries from Central and Eastern Europe, because the UK was one of the very few EU countries that opened its labor market to citizens of the new EU nations in 2004, when these countries joined the European Union. As a result, between 2004 and 2017, the share of the population who were from the European Economic Area rose from 1.5% to 5% of the UK population, with about 3 million non-British EU citizens, mostly East Europeans living in the UK. These European migrants were actually supposed to be invisible due primarily to their whiteness. But over time, as the perception spread that these East European immigrants are taking jobs from British workers, especially Poles and Romanians became increasingly racialized, facing the type of racism and xenophobia that is strikingly similar to what non-European immigrants routinely encounter in the UK. Before and after Brexit, anti-Polish sentiments and physical attacks against Polish immigrants were particularly troubling. In 2016, you could see laminated signs, I have an example up there in the left-hand corner, in English and Polish, for instance, around Cambridge, that read, "No more Polish vermin," and "Go home, Polish scum." Also in 2016, a 40-year-old Polish factory worker died in Harlow after being punched to the ground for speaking Polish in the street. And a 21-year-old Polish student was stabbed in the neck with a broken bottle because his perpetrators heard him speak Polish with his friends in Donington near Telford. Polls also showed that some of the districts with the highest support for Brexit were those that had the highest concentration of Poles, Romanians, and other Eastern and Central Europeans. Political scientists have calculated that a 1 percentage point increase in Polish immigration to the UK caused an increase in votes in favor of Brexit by about 3 percentage points. Popular support for Brexit in the UK was strongly driven by backlash against immigration from other EU countries, primarily the new East European member states that joined the EU in 2004 and 2007. And if I have a few more minutes, then maybe, I don't know. Oh, okay, so I'll be fast. I just have like a last little subtopic here, right? Because it's evident that this East European migration had an enormous impact on the sending countries as well. All the new post-communist EU member states have remained net emigration countries since they joined the EU. Westward migration has been primarily driven by the persistent income and wage gap between the eastern and western halves of the European Union. And again, without getting into detail, I think you can see the color differences, right? And they kind of describe this very sharp split in wage and income. So wage level, so despite earlier predictions and of course significant economic growth, income convergence has been nearly unnoticeable or occurring extremely slowly. Wage levels in Eastern Europe still remain at about 30–40% of the EU average. As a result of the combination of massive outflows and little influx of new immigrants into the region, several countries, especially Romania, Hungary, Poland, have begun to experience chronic labor shortages in several industries, including construction industry, retail, hospitality industries, and most notably, healthcare. The exodus of healthcare workers, especially doctors and nurses, has been increasingly undermining the quality of care in several countries. Romania has lost half of its doctors between 2009 and 2015. A few years after Poland joined the EU, 60% of graduating medical students plan to pursue work abroad. Slovakia had about 15,000 practicing physicians. 3,800 of them have applied to leave since then. The pressing labor shortages should make these countries more open to accepting immigrants, but we see the exact opposite and categorical rejection of immigration. East European countries, as traditional sending countries, have a very ambivalent relationship to immigration. The somewhat slowing but steadily continuing emigration from this region highlights the persistent economic divide between the eastern and western halves of the continent, and that the hopes of quickly catching up with the economic prosperity of the West have been greatly exaggerated. This feeds the continuing anxiety of the population that taking large numbers of immigrants from poorer countries can further set back and undercut the slow gains of European integration. So I'm just going to stop here, and I hope I didn't go too much over time, and we can talk about this more later. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Vera. Our next speaker will be Donatella, so she'll be coming up, and we'll give you 20 minutes.
So thank you very much for this invitation on these so important topics. The subject of my paper is the conflict between the nation state and the migrants. Because I think that in order to understand what's going on, it is necessary to consider this conflict, which is, I think, an epochal conflict. In the eyes of the state, the migrant represents an anomaly, a challenge to its sovereignty. Not only is the migrant an intruder, an outlaw, an illegal person, with her existence, she breaks the cardinal rule around which the state has been built. The migrant hints at the possibility of a world otherwise organized. The rights of the migrant, starting with her freedom to move, bump therefore into state sovereignty exercised over the nation and its territorial extension. To reaffirm its sovereign power, the state stops the migrant at the border, at the frontier, the eminent place for confrontation and conflict. It can admit or expel the migrant into the space it governs. To this end, it is ready to manifestly violate human rights. The border becomes thus not only the rock against which so many lives shipwreck, but also the obstacle raised against every right of migrating. This contradiction is all the more striking in the case of Western democracies, which have arisen by proclaiming both human rights and the rights of citizens. Following dilemma comes to light, which is valid: human rights or the rights of the citizen? In the forms and ways in which it manifests itself in the new millennium, migration is closely linked to the modern state. With the aim of monitoring their own borders, nation-states discriminate and mark a barrier between citizens and foreigners. Without this discrimination, the state would not exist. Borders assume an almost sacral value, referring to a semi-mythic origin, because it is due to this act of defining and discriminating that the state structure can be established, can stay, being state. This is the exact opposite of mobility. The more imperative this task is, as in the nation state, the stronger is the aspiration to homogeneity and identity. This explains then why, I think, reflecting on migration also means rethinking the state. The migrant unmasks the state. The migrant at the outer margin questions its foundation, denounces its discrimination, reminds the state of its historical becoming, and discredits its mythical purity. Thus, the migrant forces us to rethink the state. In this sense, migration carries within itself a subversive charge. Today's world is subdivided into multiple states that simultaneously face one another, confront one another, and support one another. For the children of the nation, the state-centric perspective is obvious. We take it for granted to look at migration from within, entrenched within the borders of our state. We are urged, therefore, to consider the nation state as if it were a natural phenomenon, while, on the contrary, it is an historical phenomenon. We are urged to become accomplices of the state, of our state, in order to safeguard our privileges. This is why, when issues of the so-called migration crisis are discussed in the public discourse, the point of view of those who belong to a state is always tacitly assumed. It is not by chance that questions only rotated around the ways in which a government regulates the fluxes. The differences lie mostly between those who see in the migrants a useful expedient, an opportunity, and those who denounce their danger. The state-centric view is always normative. Citizens belonging to the state are granted the freedom to decide, the prerogative to welcome or to exclude the foreigner who knocks at their door. The sovereign power to say no appears undisputed. With its norms, international law does nothing else but validate the claims of the states. However, although this right is legal, can it be said to be legitimate? Can states prevent or limit migration, and do, this is for me perhaps the most important question, do citizens have the sovereignty to say no? The primacy of citizens has been especially affirmed in recent years. It emerges in their power to control borders and govern residency. This primacy articulates itself in a grammar of us and ours, of property, of belonging, and identity. Here, political consensus coagulates. What counts is our country, of which citizens consider themselves legitimate owners, being thus authorized to deny or limit its access to foreigners. Grievous confusions are hidden here, because people imagine that citizenship is equivalent to the possession of land. And above all, people imagine that they can decide with whom they may cohabit. It is the ideology of sovereignism, which is based on presumed homogeneity, that is, on the integrity of a nation and the property of the territory. As for national integrity, it is clear to everyone that the state is not a homogeneous ethno-national community, nor can we understand culture as an identitarian property. Whenever one claims to defend a pretended ethnic homogeneity, there the old ghosts of the jus sanguinis and the jus soli re-emerge, whereby I think that the latter, the right of the soil, is even more dangerous. The territory of the state would be the private property of the citizens that reside there, as if everybody could claim to a part of that collective possession. The close link between state sovereignty and private ownership of the land must not be overlooked. This right, however, is written nowhere. It is actually a myth. It is the myth of autochthony that arose in ancient Athens and had an extraordinary success. Autochthony means that since I was born in a certain place, that place belongs to me. It is my property, and I may exclude others. In this state-centric context, the migrant who appears at the border is at once perceived as a dangerous foreigner, a hidden and clandestine enemy, an invading savage, a potential terrorist, certainly not a guest. The conditions that limit hospitality are dictated by an implicit underlying hostility. To welcome them, not to welcome them, how to distinguish the migrant from the refugee, how to lay out criteria for selection and for exclusion. Citizens are called to become indisputable arbiters, supreme judges, with the right to exclude or admit newcomers on the basis of the evidence offered. Persecutions and abuses for asylum seekers, utility for economic immigrants, the will to integrate for everyone else. The human rights of foreigners are suspended by administrative accounting, while all the privileges and immunities held by the citizens are strongly supported. In the political mediatic discourse, in which words are often voided of their content or are banned to designate their contrary, the so-called policy of welcoming is the formulation that indicates a policy management of migratory flows, a border control that leads to refoulement or internment. To date, it seems sovereignism, I prefer to speak not of populism, but of sovereignism. To date, it seems that sovereignism has the best hand everywhere, also on the left, which is very serious. With the pretext of pragmatic realism, state xenophobia, made stronger by property parochialism and welfare chauvinism, can cast a shadow over the welcoming of migrants, which is always read within the horizon of an incumbent threat. Following undue confusion, such as that belonging would be equivalent to the warranty of exclusive benefits, social justice, this is very important, social justice is limited to the national borders. The poor is being set against the migrant. It is said that welfare can function only at the national level, as if globalization did not require thinking about global justice and fighting for it. Would it be enough to simply invoke open borders? No. The abstract defense of mobility, which is certainly a fundamental right of the individual, is nothing else but the other phase of liberal thought. To reclaim freedom of movement in such an abstract form means not only to reduce migration to the pedestrian platitude of circulation, but also to completely neglect the decisive issue of welcome. It would then be enough to eliminate barriers so that everybody would be free to move across a planet understood as a big market, as a convenient space of exchange, an immense marketplace of decisions and opportunities open to everybody. But a person has undergone the tortures of war, who has endured hunger and misery, does not ask to circulate freely wherever it be, and hopes instead to arrive to a place in which the world can once more be in common. The migrant does not pretend to join a community of the world citizens. The migrant expects rather to be able to cohabit with others. The question is much wider. It is necessary to ask for more. Migration is not a biological data. It is not a simple movement. It refers to the landscape in which one encounters the stranger, in which the ethical political praxis of hospitality is inaugurated. There is no migration without change of place, without the other, and without that encounter that might precipitate into a clash. Migrating is an existential and political act that has yet to be recognized. The jus migrandi is the human right of the new millennium, sustained by militant associationism, international movements, and by more and more aware and vigilant public opinion. It will ask for a struggle comparable to that for the abolition of slavery. There is no right of migration without hospitality, which ought not be understood in the reductive sense of Kant's proposal for a right of visit, but rather as a right of residency. This can happen only when we realize that in the planetary exile of globalization, we are all resident foreigners. The both ancient and new figure of resident foreigner will disrupt the logic of solid fences that assign a dwelling to the citizens. The short circuit links the foreigner to residency, to dwelling, and modifies both. Dwelling has nothing to do with having. It has to do with being. Neither does it mean to settle, to establish oneself, to become sedentary, to make body with the earth. The path is indicated by the resident foreigner who dwells in the furrow of separation from the earth, recognized as a non-appropriable, who dwells in the link with the citizen, who in turn discovers to be a resident foreigner too. In the city of foreigners, citizenship coincides with hospitality. Asylum, this old juridical institution, has no more reason to be. Hospitality must be inscribed in citizenship. The latter cannot remain unchanged. I'm not talking about democratizing citizenship, freeing it from the nation. I'm talking instead about going beyond citizenship. Going beyond the old concept of citizenship also means bringing out all the limits of cosmopolitanism. In sum, it is neither about being proclaimed as citizens or world citizens, nor about extending world citizenship. It is about going beyond into that space we must live together in. This is what is at stake: to cohabit. A new way of understanding community is possible. In the post-Nazi era, the idea that it is legitimate to decide with whom we should cohabit has held firm. Each to their own home. It is here that populist xenophobia finds its greatest strength. Crypto-racism is its springboard. However, it is often unknown that this is a direct legacy of Hitlerism, because Hitlerism is actually the first project of a biopolitical remodeling of the planet, and one which purported to fix a stable criteria for cohabitation. The discriminatory act claims an exclusive place for itself. Whoever accomplishes this act erects herself as a sovereign subject who, fantasizing about a supposed identity between herself and that place, demands her rights of ownership, as if the other, who has already always preceded her, did not have any rights or has never even existed. In this claim hides an ancestral violence. That sovereign subject, be it an I or a we, is nothing but a usurper that aims at substituting herself to the other. Thus it cancels, together with the other, all ethics, because no one has ever been chosen and everyone on the earth has temporarily had a place where another lived first, a place in which she therefore cannot demand possession. To recognize the other's precedences in the place in which one lives means opening up not only to an ethics of proximity, but also to a politics of cohabitation. The core of cohabitation, the core implicit in such cohabitation, should be understood in its broadest and deepest sense, not only meaning participation, but also indicated simultaneity. This is not a matter of rigidly standing one right next to the other. In a world crisscrossed by the combined paths of so many exiles, to cohabit means to share the spatial proximity in a temporal convergence where the past of each person can be articulated in the common present, indeed in the perspective of a common future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Donatella. And our final speaker, Cass Moody.
I want to thank the organizers for bringing me here. I want to thank Ezra in particular for pairing me with two female colleagues, something that sadly doesn't happen very often. I want to speak today specifically about the relationship between the so-called refugee crisis and the rise of populism. And before I start there, let me first clarify that actually for most of the time that we have been talking about the issue of immigration, immigration was really not an issue. Right? Economic immigration was pretty much halted in 73, 74 in most countries. And the only people that were able to still get into Europe in some numbers came through family reunion, which was almost impossible to regulate without upsetting all kind of international obligations, as well as political asylum, which particularly during the Cold War was relatively limited, and the only explosions of it were white from communist countries. And by and large, they served Western purposes to show that our system was better than the other one, and so it was therefore not politicized. In that sense, in terms of like real immigration debates, I can only really remember two. Early 90s, as a consequence of the fall of communism, but particularly the Yugoslav Civil War, which led to massive panic in 92, 93, and pretty much a revision of asylum by almost all mainstream parties. There was virtually not yet a populist party involved. And then now more recently. Now, I'm going to focus on three things. First, did the so-called refugee crisis cause populism? I can already tell you it didn't. But it did create the perfect storm for one form of it. And then I will look at four consequences for politics in Europe. I limit myself to Europe. There are similarities to the United States, for example, but they're a little bit too complex to go into. Now, so first of all, did the so-called refugee crisis of 2015 cause populism? No, it didn't, because the rise of populism predates it by, 15 to about 20 years. Already in the 1990s, several parties that are considered populist scored really high. Front National, FPÖ in particular. FPÖ still has its record score in 1999 rather than today. It was probably more of a catalyst, as was the Great Recession. But what is specifically important about the so-called refugee crisis is that it really only affected one part of the populist movement, and that was the populist radical right. And so I find it problematic to speak about a populist response to the refugee crisis, because there is a populist aspect to it, as I will explain, but some of the left-wing populist parties have actually been by far the most accommodating. I mean, the example of Greece is in many ways absolutely remarkable, a country going through the worst crisis that pretty much any European country has had in the post-war period, that still today grapples with tens of thousands of stranded asylum seekers who are caught between pretty much the West and Turkey. And the state has provided for it as far as it could, and Syriza has stood by it. And so in that sense, when we're talking about the response, we're talking about the populist radical right. And for the populist radical right, the refugee crisis was a perfect storm, because it could be related to its three core features: nativism, authoritarianism, and populism. Now, the nativism is pretty clear. Nativism is a xenophobic form of nationalism in which you believe that you should have a monocultural state, and in which you treat pretty much anyone who isn't native as a threat. And so having over 1 million of others coming at you is perfect for the nativist argument. But it was linked to the second part, which is authoritarian, by the link that was made in much of the media, as well as in politics, between the so-called refugee crisis and the terrorist attacks of 2015-16, mostly in Paris and Brussels. And so now it was not just a threat of a cultural threat, but it was a true security threat in terms of terrorism coming our way. Authoritarianism is the second core feature of the populist radical right. And so the other thing that the populist radical right has always done is, in a sense, racialize or ethnicize crime and threat. And so this link of the other with physical threat comes natural to the populist radical right, and of course was heavily helped by the mainstream. If you look at not just tabloid media, but broader media was very quick to make a connection between the refugees, asylum seekers coming in, and so-called Syria fighters who came back, even though even today we barely have any evidence of actually someone who was a true asylum seeker involved in the terrorism. Now, it links to populism because of the EU dimension. And this is something that Virak already pointed to, and that made it so important because, of course, this is about Schengen in particular, and about not having sovereignty about your own borders. And so now countries, populist radical right parties in different countries could blame the European Union, both as its structure and as an elite, for the insecurity that allegedly their countries were undergoing as a consequence of the so-called refugee crisis. Right? It was because of the EU that they couldn't protect themselves because they are not allowed to have national borders. On top of that, it was the EU in the form of Merkel who forced the asylum seekers on them. Like, it was a German decision, but everyone else had to pay the price for it, which plays into the populism of the elite in Brussels, as well as the national elites that bow to Brussels rather than represent their own people. Right? Now, that aspect, of course, also has nativism in it. So what you see is that the so-called refugee crisis, right, really goes to the core of the agenda, of the ideological agenda of the populist radical right, which was perfectly placed to respond to that. Now, I think there are four consequences to European politics since the refugee crisis. The question really at the moment is, was this temporary or is this structural? And I think some are temporary and some might be structural. It's difficult to say because, of course, we're also still kind of at the back of the Great Recession. And so isolating the different factors isn't always easy, but there are a few things that are much more related to the refugee crisis than the other. So there are four consequences that I can see. There was a rise of xenophobia. There was a surge in the support of the populist radical right. There was a far-right turn of mainstream parties. And there was what I call an urbanization of the EU. So let me go through those four. First, there clearly was a rise in xenophobia, but not necessarily so much in attitudes as in saliency. And that makes sense because xenophobia are attitudes which are semi-permanent. They don't change overnight. People have been xenophobic for decades, and they were probably far more xenophobic 50 years ago than they are today. But the issue of threat by the other, right, and the relevance of xenophobic attitudes became much more prominent, pretty much to the extent that immigration became the top issue for nativist people, for people who held xenophobic sentiments. And you clearly saw that even though that started to wane also pretty much after the Turkey deal, it is now, again, as Vierak shows, desperately kept on the agenda by those who profit from it. Right? And so Orban is making an extra play to make sure that the 2019 elections are about immigration and the threat, because that has paid off. Other countries have done the same. It is important to note, though, that although the radical right broader sets the agenda in many ways, it doesn't execute the agenda always. It determines what we talk about and particularly how we talk about it, but the people who do the talking are actually the mainstream. There are only a few countries in which the populist radical right truly have a dominant voice in the public debate. Obviously, Hungary being the example. There's virtually no space outside. But in most countries like the Netherlands or even Britain, like in Britain, there's only one UKIP newspaper. It's the Daily Express. All the other newspapers are linked, if they link to any party, to either Conservative or Labour. But what we see is that much of the debate, the mainstream functions in a sense as an amplifier. Now, we also saw in opinion polls an absolute surge in the support for populist radical right parties. Most parties reached new heights ever. Like Marine Le Pen, for example, peaked at 35% for the first round in the presidential elections. In the end, in 2017, she would get less in the second round. Party for Freedom in my country, the Netherlands, peaked around 25%, far higher than it ever been. All parties pretty much went really high, but you could see a peak in roughly the mid of 2016 going down at the end of 2016. The Turkey deal being crucial here. Now, what did the Turkey deal bring? Leaving aside the, in my opinion, amoral aspects to it, there are two aspects to it. Not only did the number go down, the number already was down before. What is the crucial part of a crisis, of the term crisis, is out of control. The Turkey deal gave back the illusion of control. It gave back this idea that the mainstream parties had immigration under control. So even if numbers were still there, people believed that they were managed. And so the crisis as such was over. Not necessarily the immigration, but the crisis was over. And as a consequence, many people who had moved to the populist radical right in the polls were moving back to mainstream parties. Now, those mainstream parties, as is my third point, had moved significantly to the right in terms of primarily nativism. Now, there's nothing new about that. We have seen a mainstreaming of an anti-immigration discourse for probably about 2 decades. However, in most of the cases, it didn't really lead to much policies. And one of the consequences of that was that we had mainstream parties, primarily of the right, but not only, quite a lot of social democratic parties adopted a lot of the populist radical right rhetoric, who would talk like critical about European Union, about immigration, about Islam, but didn't fundamentally change anything. On top of that, most of the critique was not a fundamental critique, for example, of multiculturalism. It was a critique of the way it had been implemented. So Merkel, Sarkozy, Cameron, all already well before the so-called refugee crisis had declared that multiculturalism had failed. Right? Didn't provide any evidence, and in most cases it was never really tried, but that's irrelevant. What they had said, it had failed, but the goal was still to implement it in a better way. What has changed since 2015 is that mainstream politicians no longer just say that we should stop immigration because there are too many and we can't regulate it. We should stop it because it's threatening. And so politicians like my Prime Minister Mark Rutte will link immigration directly to problems. Actually, the Dutch foreign minister has literally said that he doesn't know an example of a successful multicultural society. Right? Those are Trump words, who literally come out of the center. This is a formerly liberal, I would say now conservative party. This is not just like it didn't work. It's not about policies that don't achieve the integrated multicultural society that we wanted. No, this goes to the core. We don't want to be a multicultural society. And that shift is new. And you see it at almost all levels. And one of the problems of that is that actually it has become much harder today to make clear distinctions between particularly mainstream right-wing parties and populist radical right parties. Now that claim has been made a lot before, and I've always been very hesitant, because actually I think it was always very clear, because at least the mainstream right said we would like to have immigrants and regulate it. Sure, there was always implicitly some type of like white supremacy order in it, but they could come if they adopted blah, blah, blah. Like, we don't have that anymore. And if you look, for example, at France, a party like the Republicans has shifted so much to the right that it's really fundamentally pretty hard to distinguish its arguments about nationality and about what the nation state should look like from Front National. If anything, the key critique that you hear from the Republicans as well as its newspapers, like Le Figaro, is actually not on socio-cultural policies of Marine Le Pen, it's on the socio-economic ones. She's too left-wing. Right? If you look at the fundamental arguments coming out of the Conservative Party in the Netherlands, Conservative Party in Britain, the CSU in Germany, I could go on and on. All of these have now really become a question of degree rather than of true substance. Now, the fourth point is what I call the urbanization of the EU, and that has to do with my obsession, which is Viktor Orban, and the way that the populist radical right has become a part of the mainstream. What sets Orban apart is not his views. His views are identical and increasingly more extreme than those of Geert Wilders or Marine Le Pen. What sets him apart is that he does this within the confines of the European People's Party, the main political group in Europe considered mainstream. On top of that, he has transformed the EPP. One of the reasons why naive people like me were totally unsuccessful in trying to get him out was that actually a growing group of members of the EPP share the type of discourse as well as make coalitions with populist radical right parties. And so Orban was very successful in transforming the EPP in the mainstream of the right. A few years ago, I would say he was more successful within the EPP than Angela Merkel, got massive applause at a speech. Now, if we want to end on a positive note, there seems to be a shift. At the moment, Orban is under unprecedented pressure to stay within the EPP. On a more negative note, if you see what Manfred Weber, who is the boss of the EPP, demands of Orban to stay in the EPP, you will actually note that it by and large has nothing to do with his populist radical right ideology. It has more to do with his loyalty towards his political group and towards the European Union. Thank you.
A few speakers come up front if they could. So we'll go ahead and open it up for questions and answers now. I think we've had three excellent speeches that have put a number of issues on the table and talked about a number of different countries and some very important questions. So why don't we go ahead and open it up? We'll start down here why don't we take three questions and then we'll bring it back to our panelists and then hopefully we can take time for a little bit for some other questions from the audience.
Thank you very much for three stimulating talks. I'm Sidney Tarrow in the Government Department and adjunct professor in the Cornell Law School. And I would wonder at the absence of a word from, I think, all three of these excellent presentations, and that word is movement. If we were talking about Donald Trump, we would have difficulty getting past the first few sentences without taking up the idea that Trump is the leader of a movement. Yet I never heard the word movement from any of the three speakers. Perhaps I missed it. And I wonder if you think that we can truly understand the populist radical right if we only look at them as parties, and if we don't consider that there is a movement basis behind them. Thank you.
All right, let's go for another question here in the back. We're going to take three questions.
Thank you. I'd like to, this is Simten Joshar. I'm a visiting scholar with CIES. I would be as brief as possible and keep myself calm because I'm a bit upset. But thank you for this great panel and thanks for all the enlightening presentations. I'd like, and I'm going to read because I just don't want to spoil what I want to say. I'd like to point at the intersection between populism and elitism that runs through the xenophobic exposures today that legally non-resident peoples of the world are forced to encounter. On March 7 at this university, and just before the start of this invaluable panel, I consider it another instance of learning through everyday life experiences to have been subjected to a deed of otherization, clearly aiming at degradation. The deed was by an elderly, white, male academic, speaking in his mother language, to me and my colleague, which is our foreign language, thus having the latitude to play with the unniceties of his language. Hence, when he heard that one of us is both Swedish and Turkish, with Sweden and Turkey citizenships, he could deliberately refer to calling such women as Swedish Turkish delight. So perhaps such micro-incidents should not be considered just as incidental, but as layers of the call to citizens to be complicits in the anti-egalitarian policies that run through the everyday politics today throughout the world, and not necessarily by those people who proclaim to be populist and authoritarian and endorse authoritarian practices, but also by those who claim to stand on the anti-populist line. Thank you, and sorry if I spoil it.
Andre, teach philosophy. So I wonder what's populism really about and whether we are misusing that label in the context of this discussion. So I'm sure we can understand the idea of populism in very different ways. My understanding of it, that it's a kind of form of political Protestantism. It's kind of bypassing, setting aside institutions and establishment and all that, and purportedly directly representing the people, that kind of Latin American style, I guess. I don't see a lot of that in this context. What I see is the breakdown of the traditional post-Second World War arrangements, political arrangements, especially in Europe, but possibly in the US as well and other places. So, you know, after the war, Europe was kind of divided, all European countries divided power and resources and everything between the left and right, mainstream left, mainstream right, more or less, socialist, Christian Democrats, and the unions were tied with the socialists, rich people with Christian Democrats, Catholic Church with Christian Democrats, so on and so forth. There was a sense that everybody's okay, right? That seems to have broken down. There seems to be a growing middle that feels totally unrepresented by the left and right, and then can be easily exploited by these anti-immigration, xenophobic, nationalistic propaganda. And something like that probably happens in the US and probably happens other places. So I'm just not sure what the idea of populism is doing here. I mean, it's there in the margins, but it doesn't look like what we think of as kind of standard populist political agenda.
Okay. Thank you. So why don't we go ahead and we'll let our panelists respond. Vera, would you like to go ahead?
Sure, I can start. Yeah.
Respond to anything?
So maybe I start with the missing word movement. Yeah, so it's missing. I'm not sure that it's just an oversight. I actually don't work on parties, so I'm looking at the cultural production of nationalist populism in Hungary, explicitly to move beyond parties, but I would not call them movements. Especially in Hungary, I think a lot of these practices are cultural practices. There are symbolic practices. They take place through things like fashion, heritage tourism, martial arts, horseback archery. They take place in civil society organizations that are not democratic and liberal, but they would not be kind of organized social movements. So I think there is space beyond the parties, but I'm not sure that they are social movement types of spaces. I think that's an empirical question. I can speak most authoritatively for Hungary, and these are cultural practices, through consumption, through civil society practices, not as kind of organized social movements. And then, what is populism here? Whether we just see a breakdown of kind of post-World War II arrangement. Well, that already, to me, as an Eastern European, it also broke down in 1989. So I think, your perspective sounded to me very, very kind of Western. Everything was fine until now, where, not quite in communist Eastern Europe. That's also part of Europe today. And if the Cold War is part of this arrangement, I'm not sure that's something we would want to maintain or we should have been happy with. So there was already a huge breakdown in 1989. And I think what we see in terms, or where I see, what this populism is about, it is kind of a new way of doing democratic politics, right? So, and the populism is, this division between the people versus the elite. It's also kind of the glorification of majority rule, kind of bypassing checks and balances, constitutional court, rule of law, this impatience for all these kind of democratic institutions, and then playing with other tools like direct democracy. This is happening in a lot of countries, even in France, now with these like town hall debates. It's a totally kind of populist move from Macron. But we do see a new way of kind of doing democracy. Maybe this is a hollowing out of democracy, right? It's a charade, but it's still, I think, in terms of democratic practices, it is something new. And you can empirically kind of map these new practices. And I think it happens for a reason, because of a lot of, I think, structural conditions as well. Going back to neoliberalism, to me, that's another word that's kind of missing. I think a lot of these structural changes we see in Europe today, and what the refugee crisis is used for, is dealing with kind of the fallout from neoliberalist regimes. that was also part of this post-World War II arrangement. And maybe I'm not sure how to respond to the third question. I think maybe I would say that it's also a little bit risky to go into this division, that the only social division that matters today is between like citizens and immigrants, because there are a lot of other social divisions, right? And also, again, I'm using the example of Hungary, because in Hungary, actually, immigration was not an issue until 2015. It was really not an issue. The issue was with marginalizing the Roma population, right? So those social divisions are also directed against, and marginalization are directed at a lot of other groups than just immigrants. So maybe that's important to note. So I stop there.
If I can go off on that, even immigration is very tricky. By far the biggest immigration population in much of Central Eastern Europe is from Central Eastern Europe or further east. And so in the Czech Republic, for example, parties go crazy across the board towards Muslim immigration, while at the same time the number of Ukrainians is through the roof, and totally not politicized by any of these parties. And so it's always a construction, and like in general, there is a general problem with externalizing prejudice or illiberal thought. I mean, that was one of the points. I mean, at the very least, they are enabled by the mainstream, but not only for strategic reasons. I mean, prejudices are part of the center of society as well. Like any survey shows that like the number of people who hold prejudices goes far beyond what radical right parties can muster. And so I mean, this is actually one of the things that I've always like hammered on, is that the main threat comes from the center, and not from the margins. Hello, Sid. I must admit that I struggle a bit with where I place the movement in this. I think the US is actually remarkably a much better story and a much easier story. While Trump himself was, of course, not involved with the Tea Party, I consider his success in very large extent a consequence of the mobilization of the Tea Party, as to a certain extent the success of Bernie Sanders profited from the mobilization of the Occupy Wall Street, perhaps more discursive than organizatorily, particularly for Occupy Wall Street, which had no. I think one of the big problems in academia and generally liberal understanding of the Tea Party is they just have written it off as astroturf, and the grassroots of the Tea Party were much, much stronger than people knew. And I mean, I was at that time living in Indiana, for example, and they had remarkable mobilization. Now in Europe, which is a much more party-driven context, I find the concept of the radical right as a social movement more problematic. I'm not necessarily saying that it doesn't help, but it is very party-centric and party-driven. I think that one of the interesting things, though, is we have seen a mobilization against refugees outside, both inside and outside of parties. I mean, one of the interesting and troubling things is I've seen a lot of pretty massive and sustained anti-refugee demonstrations that were not led by parties. They were not necessarily led by what I would say real social movement, because there was even for that too little structure. And I think some of massively overplayed, like Pegida, which is much smaller and much less successful. But for Slovakia, for example, had like one of the biggest post-communist demonstrations against refugees. Far-right parties played a minor role. And so I think there's something there. It has died out a bit. Right? It can come back maybe, but...
Okay. First of all, I would say it is for me not clear which is the difference between, in our debate, between populism, nationalism, and sovereignism. It is, and actually I agree, populism is, for me, not necessarily a negative concept. So in this sense, I find I find problematic, the way in which, for instance, you use the term, the term populism. I think that in Europe, for instance, in Germany, many people speak of authoritarian nationalism. In Italy, we speak of sovereignism, and also in other European countries. I think that sovereignism or authoritarian nationalism is better, because it's actually as you say, is a new form of this old patriotism, very dangerous, authoritarian nationalism. But I would say I prefer to use the word sovereignism because, and here I have perhaps also a question for Cass, because I don't see, I mean, of course we have a big migration crisis. But the problem, which is the real reason for the crisis? Also, I think that the problem is the European Union, and that it's very difficult also to make a comparison between the US and the European Union, because the problem, European Union is, I think, for many European citizens, is a big disillusion, because it is not a post-national form. It is not a new political form. It is just an union of different nation states with many tensions between them. And the big disillusion is this. So it is not a problem for me that the nation states have lost their sovereignty, but the contrary, the opposite. That means that the fact that the European Union is not a new political form, a post-national form, without nation states. This is the problem, not the migration. And the migration is, for me, the way in which the nation states have reacted is just the effect, not the reason. So, for me, is the perspective is quite different. Okay.
Do we have time for a couple more questions? Okay, there's one right here.
Hi, Mona Krul, Government Department. So I have a question for Kars, or probably two questions. So you said that the mainstream parties shifted to the right, that we saw that too. But I would say, actually would argue that this is a pretty normal phenomenon that always happens when niche parties appear that are very successful, that the mainstream parties, so the right mainstream party would try to absorb that. And it's not, I think, necessarily bad, because think of Germany, if Merkel would have been more Christian democratic or more to the right over the years and less social democratized in the Grand Coalition, for example, which she liked, probably the AfD would never have that successful, because there wouldn't have been that ideological void in the party system that she would have left for them. Meanwhile, they have shifted to the right, but probably left it more to the CSU and Seehofer, like play good cop, bad cop the entire time. This would be one of the questions. Do you actually see like that this is a chance that these kind of parties might disappear again if the mainstream right fulfills that purpose again? And the other thing is, like you said that the EU-Turkey role played a central role. I'm not so sure about that, because I'm not so sure if people have understood the EU-Turkey deal, really. It was very complicated. It was like a weird shipping around of people. I even had trouble to explain that to students in lectures. So how is this going to help solve the refugee crisis? If you take two, we take one back, and how does that go? What I would totally support is your argument of EU blaming. I think they had so much success, the far-right parties, also because this was an EU-wide refugee crisis. And there are not many institutions that you can think of that are more elitist than the EU, even if it has probably become more democratic over time. But it was the perfect anti-elite blaming that you could do with having the EU as kind of the enemy here. So I would totally support that point, yeah. But I would like to hear what you think about the other two.
Hi, thanks. My name is Ali Saroni. I'm an assistant professor in the government department. And I'm going to kind of echo Mona's question in that, so I worry a lot about kind of the danger of populist appeals, because it is kind of used inappropriately, and it's a very kind of vague concept in a lot of political scenarios, right? And populist appeals, you know, we know that they feed on fear and globalization and kind of economic crises, and there's a lot of misinformation. So, you know, overstating the refugee threat or overstating problems with immigrants that we know are not empirically true, right? So it's a very effective appeal, and it's being strategically used by politicians. I also teach a fake news class at Cornell, so we spend a lot of time talking about the dangers of kind of misinformation. Now, I'm going to ask the whole panel, so what do we do, right? To fix this, should we focus on voters and making voters more informed about the differences between all these types of concepts, you know, bring back, you know, civics into the classroom? Or is this really the task of mainstream parties to provide alternate views and alternate options for voters? And Sherry Berman was just here a couple weeks ago, and she put a lot of the onus on kind of the existing political system to deal with funneling these kind of radical. So, given your expertise, what should we do now?
Is there one more?
Thank you. So Enzo.
Yeah, we got, she's waiting it back behind as well. But that's go ahead, sir, and we'll take one more.
No, you go ahead.
Okay. So Enzo Traverso from Roman Studies. So it seems to me that the refugee crisis in the latest years reveals a more both political and moral crisis of the European Union. It reveals a kind of moral bankruptcy of the European Union, which could be compared to the European crisis of the years between the two world wars. The European Union summits devoted to the refugee crisis sometimes evoke the Evian summit of 1938 devoted to the Jewish refugees crisis. So, and the conclusion was exactly the same. We are unable to receive, and we don't want to receive them. So this is a simple assessment, but statement. But two very short observations. It seems to me that the Hungarian case is very interesting and significant because it go beyond the Hungarian boundaries. So it is revealing of European and probably Western dimension of the rise of this new right-wing populism, because Viktor Orban's nationalism reveals a new connection between an old pillar of European nationalism, which is anti-Semitism, and a new constitutive element of populism and nationalism, which is Islamophobia and the rejection of Muslim immigrants. And this shift from anti-Semitism to Islamophobia is one of the main features of this European new right-wing populism, but this new populism reformulates, reproduces, and transforms many elements inherited from old anti-Semitism. And the third point, which seems to me extremely relevant, and which was put forward by Donatella Di Cesare in her presentation, so the European refugee crisis reveals dramatically an historical contradiction between a political form inherited from the 19th century, which is the nation state, and the reality of 21st century globalization. And all answers to this crisis, to this contradiction, that will not approach this fundamental question, inevitably will fail. This is, it seems to me, a fundamental question.
How do you see the politics of migration and the questions it necessarily raises about citizenship and the nature of the state? How do you see them playing out in the context of the world's growing urbanization? Given the multiple levels of governance from above and below, can an activist push towards claiming a right to the city or a right to sanctuary in a city be useful in a European context? And I am an urban geographer. My name is Alyssa Sampson.
I just want to make, I like interdisciplinary meetings, but it also creates a bit of a problem because I feel that we're talking at times really completely past each other and doing different things. Like, I haven't laid out how I want the world to be. That's not why I'm here. And as a consequence, I feel that I have to defend things which are not my position at all. Personally, I think populism, the way I define it, has a strained relationship with liberal democracy. Empirically, studies have shown that it can have both positive and negative effects. Depends on how much power it has, depends on the strength of liberal democracy. Now, with regard to whether it's normal, whether moving to the right or to wherever your challenger is, whether it's normal and whether it works in particular, right? So, yes, it always happened. It happened to the Greens too. Right? It happened to the Greens in a much less extent. It happened to the Greens as it happened to the radical right in the 1990s, discursively. Right? And so all the major parties took up an environmental position in the 80s, like, and added a chapter on the environment to their program, to then, by and large, continue to ignore it, like, later. And that was how immigration and integration were added in the 1990s, pretty much. Today, as I've tried to argue, there's a fundamental shift in the ideological position. Like, mainstream right has moved from considering an integrated society and world as positive to one that is at the very least problematic, if not to be rejected. That's different. Now, empirically, I'm totally not convinced that it worked. I mean, every single time that a far-right party loses, people say, oh, you see, that's why. Like, and so they point mostly to the early 2000s in Austria, which was a split of the party for all kind of different reasons. They're back stronger, as strong, and actually more influential than they've ever been. Like, and then the Front National, didn't they implode because Sarkozy went there? No, because pretty much Jean-Marie Le Pen became senile. Like, and as soon as he's replaced by his daughter, they're back higher than they've ever been. Right? While at the same time, the mainstream right is still that much further to the right. That is where populism comes in. Like, and it is the combination of that. And even if you want to reduce it to anti-establishment sentiments, right? The problem is if an establishment party takes over the nativism, there's still a significant part of the electorate that won't vote for them because they don't trust the establishment party. Right? And so I think empirically it simply doesn't work, leaving aside moral and ideological arguments. It will work, which is what some people now argue, if you just take over their policies. But like, what is the purpose of that? Like, yeah, if we all become radical right, then there's no reason for a radical right opposition anymore. The EU-Turkey deal, it doesn't matter whether people understand it. I mean, most people here don't understand the American political system or the electoral system. Right? They still think it's the best in the world. Right? The point is that what the EU elite was very good at selling outside of Italy, right, was that the crisis was over. And this actually directly ties into Italy. I mean, one of the reasons, and I think the main reason why the EU has pretty much left Italy to its own devices, is if it would have accepted the claim that immigration was a problem in the Italian context, it would have to accept that the EU-Turkey deal did actually not solve the whole problem. And there were too many political careers invested in that. Like, not just Merkel, but Kurz as well, and Rutte, and pretty much everyone. Like, and so it doesn't matter whether it worked. It doesn't matter what the details are. The idea was, and was also pushed in the media very strongly, that numbers are falling, and this is because they took bold action. Right? And so I think that's important. The point about moral bankruptcy, I don't like to see politics in moral terms. I don't think there's a moral bankruptcy, but that's just a normative judgment on it. There's an ideological bankruptcy. Right? The world, the ideological hegemony of the 1990s, which for the sake of argument we're going to call neoliberalism, right, is that. The order isn't, but no one defends it anymore. No one actually believes that neoliberalism works. No one really defends the European Union anymore. Right? What we have is there is no alternative, right? Which is not an ideological argument, it's a practical argument. What we have is politics of fear. And it's not just from populists, it comes from the mainstream too. The whole campaign of Remain was based on fear. If we leave, we will have a third world war, or we'll have this, or we'll have that. And so I think, and we don't have liberal democratic ideological visions, be they social democratic, Christian democratic, liberal, even green has pretty much lost it. Right? And we don't have an ideological defense of liberal democracy as a system, irrespective of the specific form you want it from. And the argument why you have limits on majority rule, and the argument of that minority rights protect everyone because everyone can become a minority at one time. Like, all of that, in a sense, this is what Chantal Mouffe points at, like, we just don't have politics anymore. And I think that's the problem, and that's where the radical right has jumped in. The radical right is uber political, right? Because partly it's populism, and it says, if we want to do something, we do it. Right? We believe that we should achieve that. Everyone says, oh, we can't because we're in the EU. And they say, then we go out. Right? What we should say to that, if we believe in something else, is why, in an ideological way, that is not the right decision. Not that this is dumb or this is scary or whatever. And so, to me, the crisis is ideological. We're currently living in a system that has lost its ideological support.
Okay, so maybe I try to take it kind of quickly, bullet point style, and the first question about what shall we do? I mean, first I would say I'm a sociologist, not a political scientist, so we are not expected to provide like policy prescriptions of how to do things, so I never think about it, but I'm still going to say something. I think what would be important is related to what Kaz just said, that I think it would be really important to have counter narratives, right, that we just really don't have. And let me say that, if I think about the 1990s in post-socialist Eastern Europe, we also had just the terrible, flow of like nationalism, like really, really bad anti-Semitism in the 1990s. You had all this really messy, terrible stuff in the 1990s. But you also had a very strong counter-narrative about Europe. Not about the European Union, right? But about kind of a European identity that is beyond national identity, that is beyond ethnic identity, that is, culturally attractive, the economic prosperity of Europe. So this kind of complex bundle of ideas and identities that were linked to Europe as a kind of positive identifier. And we just don't have counter-narratives like that now. There is no counter-narrative to this kind of populist narrative. So I think this is what we would need. I don't know who is going to produce it. I don't quite see the actors right now, but this is what's missing. So I think people should be thinking about it. I think there are, germs of possible counter-narratives out there, because even in Hungary, which is such an extreme case, right? We have alternative narratives about what it means to belong to Hungary and what it means to be a citizen of Hungary. Now we have this very strong ethnic definition of being Hungarian. We also have a multi-ethnic definition of being Hungarian. We have a civic definition of being Hungarian, from the Austro-Hungarian times, where everybody who is willing to learn Hungarian can become a Hungarian, right? So it has a cosmopolitan definition as well, even though now this narrative is really just like completely forgotten and marginalized, right? So I think these counter-narratives would be very important to have. I think in terms of, the city question about urbanization, I would say, right, of course, empirically cities are in so many ways sanctuaries for immigrants. I mean, most of the migration immigrants concentrate. They are not equally distributed across the countries. They tend to concentrate and cluster in large cities that are more tolerant, more cosmopolitan. But then what this does in turn is it basically amplifies the rural-urban split in Europe, right? Which feeds the populist turn, right? You have this kind of cultural, economic inequalities between large cities and the countryside, and this is why in a lot of countries like France, also in Hungary, this is one of the driving forces of populism. And finally, about the moral crisis or bankruptcy. Yeah, I would say, I'm actually quite troubled. I'm kind of undercutting myself, but I'm really troubled by the fact that Hungary is seen as such an important case, because I think that's an indicator that something is really wrong, because this is a tiny country in Europe, whose language nobody speaks. So the fact that it has so much symbolic and political space in the current discourse on Europe, I think is just an indicator of the lack of vision in Europe, right? I mean, we really should not have this kind of space for Hungary. And I think in terms of the interwar parallels, I mean, we should not forget, right, that anti-Semitism, especially in the East European context was always linked to anti-capitalism, right? And what I want to say here is we really need to understand better the political economy of what is going on here. And we didn't talk so much about that, but I think the political economy of what is going on here with neoliberalism, with globalization, with European integration is really an important pillar here that we need to understand better. And I know this seems like counterintuitive, but a lot of the anti-Semitic rhetoric through the links of Jews to capitalism is kind of revived. You know, it has a political economic tune that we need to talk about, yeah, which we don't.
Okay, Donatella, we'll give you the last word.
Yeah, I think that the problem today is the political confusion, the difficulty to interpret our situation, our political scenario, because we have all the categories, and it is very difficult to use these categories, and I will make some examples. And at the same time, it is also difficult to put these categories in question. So I think the problem of what is, for instance, new populism, no? What is authoritarian nationalism, these are all, for me, attempts to read, to interpret this new situation. Perhaps I'm not so skeptic in front of European Union. I still defend the European Union. I still believe in the European Union. And I think that, but the condition is, of course, a strong reform, a new start, a new beginning. In this sense, I would like just to make an example. The problem of the concept citizens and citizenship. So what does it mean? For instance, as you perhaps know, the European passport, no, is a very strange thing, because you know, if I'm Italian, I have a passport. As Italian, I have a European passport. But if I lost the Italian citizenship, I lost at the same time the European citizenship. So it's crazy. This means that we don't have a European citizenship. And this is the problem that Enzo, that you know, that you emphasized. That means it is incredible. After the Nuremberg laws in 1935, no, in the destiny of the European Jews, the German Jews, to think that if someone, if I will lose my Italian citizenship, I am without passport, without European passport, and without passport at all. It is incredible. It is incredible. So what does it mean? No. So I think that this is the problem. The problem is the contradiction between globalization and nation state, the fact that we don't have really a political European Union, but the problem is that I see the phenomenon of populism or of authoritarian nationalism, of sovereignism, as a reaction of this problem. And of course, yes, you're right when you say that the problem is that people people criticize liberal democracy, people criticize neoliberalism, but I think that, for instance, populism is for me also this attempt to create confusion, to say we don't have more right and left, no, but the distinction is between the people and the elite, no, and so we are the people, and we are against the elite, no. Who is the people? Where are the elite? So this new distinction is very dangerous and very ambiguous, And I think that in this sense, Italy is a laboratory because populism in Italy, and I think you know the five-star movement. Five-star movement actually is allied with Lega of Salvini, which is a very radical right at government. So in this sense, I think that this movement, five-star movement, is an example of what is today populism, how ambiguous and how dangerous it is. Mm-hmm.
I think we probably better stop there so that we can get our panelists to dinner, but we thank you all very much for stimulating.